Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Adeline Goh. I'm the Head of Behavioural Science Research and Data at AIA Australia, a leading health and life insurer. Before we begin today, I'd just like to take a moment to recognise the traditional owners of the different lands on which we meet and acknowledge the Indigenous people who may be joining us here today. We would like to pay our respects to all elders past and present and wish to acknowledge and celebrate the diversity of Indigenous people and culture across Australia and from wherever you're joining us. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the UTS Economics team. UTS has developed a postgraduate program in behavioural economics, and they offer free online introduction courses to behavioural economics, including micro-credentials and a graduate certificate, as well as their master's in behavioural economics. To learn more, you can head to the link that we'll post in the chat. And with that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to our guest speaker today, Sonia Friedrich, joining us from the beautiful Byron Bay. Sonia is a leading expert and keynote speaker in behavioural science, specialising in business applications. She considers herself to be a behavioural science strategist and has spoken at prestigious events like Nudge Stock Global and Cowra Consulting Summer School. She works with Fortune 500 companies through to startups and empowers people with behavioural science aimed at helping clients to implement behavioural science interventions quickly and see measurable impacts within months. Sonia has saved clients millions and made others millions of dollars, including businesses from $750 million enterprises to small companies. She has over 20 years experience in the pharmaceutical industry and was the general manager at Grey Healthcare Advertising in Sydney. Sonia is also a founding member of Diversify, representing Australia among a group of behavioural science experts offering worldwide consulting services globally, including clients such as the Dow Jones Group, Amazon, and Fidelity. She employs a team of experts to prove measured outcomes for behavioural science interventions and is a global strategic partner with Behavioural, which she'll touch on during her presentation. They are a leader in AI and behavioural science in e-commerce. She works closely with executives to drive immediate decision-making and mentors business owners, offering intensive consultations. So with that, I'd like to welcome Sonia to our network. Thank you for joining us, Sonia.
Oh, thanks very much, Adeline, and for everybody also for being here during your lunchtime. I'm excited to share some of what we've done in behavioural science and specifically in friction. So I might just share my screen, and just if you can confirm when that comes up for you so I can get started, because I am conscious of time.
We can see that. Thanks, Sonia.
Great. Thanks, Adeline. And so I'm just trying to, there we go. So we had some topic options and decided on looking at the disruptive power of cognitive and behavioural friction. And I thought what I would do is share just some information around the background of this, some of the case studies that we've used in this space, and also some of the global leaders like Amazon and Facebook and what they're doing in this space. And then also share a little bit about the process that we go through. So there'll be some takeout. There'll be, remind me if I don't share some free materials, because there's some that you can actually tap into as well from some of those global leaders around the world. So without further ado, I will jump into it and just have a look at this space of friction. So it turns out in an average day, and that the employee who's working supposedly 8 hours a day is really only productive for 2 hours and 53 minutes specifically. And we say that the rest of that time is lost to friction. We also know, and particularly those people who work in e-commerce know, that 7 out of every 10 customers leave an e-commerce site. And so you have to ask why, what's going on? If somebody's actually come to your site with an intention, why is it that they're leaving? And certainly in the space of design and UX and CX, we know a lot in this space. However, we can go beyond that today with behavioural design as well. Globally, when you look at the cost of this, we're saying that, $3 trillion is lost to organisational drag through lost productivity every year, and more than $4.6 trillion sits in those abandoned shopping carts from people who are looking or creating wish lists and not actually just buying. And so I know there's a lot of people in behavioural science on this today, and there will be some who aren't, who are interested in this space. I think what's really changed for me is the whole concept of time. And so where we look at time in projects, we might look at, an hour a day, a week, a month. Yet with behavioural science, we're really looking at these milliseconds of time and how our brain works in these milliseconds of time. And so for me, I'd say in business today, what matters is milliseconds, and the brain matters. And if we're not actually conscious of these two and how they're operating, whether it's internally or externally, we're probably missing some of the, the gold and the nuggets that we should be looking at. So I just want you to imagine if you could get a 30% increase in customers just by doing one small nudge, and it meant that they came into your on-land retail shop. We had a success like this with one customer that I'll share. We were able to reduce churn rates for another SaaS-based business by 7.6% by working with the customer success team and removing friction from the process for onboarding and follow-up with their clients. And with another business, which is an entertainment business and does some immersive experiences, looking at just their ticketing system alone, we were able to identify a potential $9 million uplift for this business. And we identified over 100 friction points in their business. About 22 of them we saw as, critical peak end experiences that needed some attention. So when we look at this space of friction, people go, well, what is that? And on a basic level, it's pretty easy to understand. Anytime we get a barrier that stops a behavior, consciously or unconsciously, then that is what we call friction. And the critical thing, I guess, is what we know in behavioural science is that we're all irrational and most of us are unconscious to our behaviour. So through the course of behavioural science in my world in the last, 12 years, 13 years, it has been about, being the experiment of n equals 1, where I learned this lesson from Dan Ariely, when he said, practice on yourself, experiment with yourself. And so my whole reason for being really in the last 12 years has been to slow down and become really conscious of my unconscious and conscious of my, pre-thought or my behaviors, and actually then rewind and see how I actually behaved and why, or why I walked away from something. And in this space then of, making things easy or difficult for my brain, we look at this spectrum, of fluency. So something can be disfluent to fluent and going to flow. And we want to look at how easy things are for processing. And we also know our job is to make it easy. And I say, well, making it easy is one thing. I think then it's like, how do we make it easier and then easiest? So we don't stop at just thinking, well, we made that easier for a customer. We go, what else could we do to make it even easier? Because the human brain does believe more fluent information to be true. The easier it is for us to understand, the more likely we are to act. And it also increases engagement and return on investment. And so we have to understand the processing time of our own brain and how sound is the fastest, to process. But when we see an image, we don't necessarily understand an image and a word, but we process the image faster, which is why we always put, images first, words second. And with something very simple like just this on the screen, we can see that, an image of a no smoking sign is much easier for our own brain to process than no smoking or no smoking in all, uppercase. So very easily we can start to go, well, one's harder for my brain and one's easier for my brain. So I always go, well, which one makes me actually contract and which one do I actually get, this negative feeling, or I go, oh, that's too hard, and I just jump out of. In this space then of cognitive friction theory, we have to look at what that process is and where we are actually trying to intercept it with, where the brain's saying, do I engage or do I disengage? And so our sensory memory receives the information that is all around us, our daily activity, sights, smells, sounds, visuals, and it determines, and goes into our working memory, where we have this process of actually, the cogs start turning and going, should I bother or shouldn't I bother? Should I bother or shouldn't I bother? Should this go into my long-term memory or not? And so at this point in time of our working memory is when this cognitive friction is potentially occurring, or cognitive flow. And so everything we want to do is to understand, is there cognitive friction or behavioural friction, which could be, a forced behaviour that actually changes my behaviour. I think one of the easiest is, if we're driving down the street and there's a detour sign down a road we used to go to travel, to the shops or to work, as soon as we hit the detour, we have that sense of, friction because we have to go a different way. And so we want to look at how much effort is actually being used and actually reduce that amount of effort. And as I mentioned, more fluent, then it's more true. It's easier for us to understand. And the more salient the objects are, the more likely they're to be read, liked, and believed. And I think that's, all quite basic, and we all understand that quite well in the behavioural science space. So for me, I always go become this observer of yourself, because our body is this natural radar, and we have this inbuilt guidance system which we can, tap into all day, every day. And as we know, we're not making decisions on these 10,000 messages that we get a day or more. But if I contract even ever so slightly, I'm disengaging, versus when I expand and I'm actually engaged in something. So you can feel this slight engagement, disengagement. And you can do that without any technical heat maps or anything else. You can actually just observe yourself and go, why did I just walk away? Or why did my own eyeball just jump off something? And we know that, the Daniel Kahneman easy exercise of, 2 times 2 is 4. But if I ask you something more difficult, you already disengage and you don't bother, and we take that path of least effort. So in the space of friction, what we're trying to do with companies is actually get them to start thinking about when employees disengage with processes and maybe aren't showing their initiative, or just go, I'll take the path of least effort. And then separately, when with a customer, are they actually taking that path of least effort because we've made it a little bit too hard? So my challenge to everyone is start to be this observer of yourself. And so in our household here, I think we say something, the word friction, at least once, if not 10 times a day, when we're online or looking at websites, or if we're even in our pantry looking at things and going, well, this hasn't been designed very well, it's too hard to open, or around anything that is, friction. So once you start hearing the lexicon and our vocabulary change in your own home, something is shifting in terms of understanding behavior and also making it more and more conscious. And so here's my number one example that I use. I'm a big fan of these Mission gluten-free chips. And I recall one day I was in the aisle and I went to go and buy some. And what I find really quite surprising with these chips is that on the back is a perforated line here. And this perforated line has a little picture of some scissors. And so if I buy these chips, I'm not sure about you, but usually I want to have a couple in the car on the way home. But I can't actually open it. No matter how hard I try, I just can't open it. So here's this friction point, which, the unintended consequence is that it's good for my waistline, that I can't get to them straight away. But in terms of actually, the design of something and making it user-friendly for a customer, I go, okay, well, they're not really designed very well. They actually have got a friction point in how I open them. I think also in behavioural science, we always say there shouldn't be something else that is required to actually fulfil an activity. And the fact that I have to actually go and get a pair of scissors before I can open them, and then of course I can't reseal them, which I guess is part of the point, then I eat more of them. But it all requires a lot of effort. That's cognitive effort and behavioural effort in how I actually have to do it. So one day I'm in the supermarket, and I see myself in the supermarket all the time looking at behavioural science, and I've usually got my phone, so I take photos of things that I'm doing, or deals and things that are happening. What I noticed is I actually wanted to get some of these chips, and I wanted some of these corn chips, and I went to them and I just went, oh, they're too hard to open. And I literally found myself walking from one aisle around the corner to the next aisle, and I bought the best, potato chips ever, which are these Red Rock sea salt chips, if you've ever tried them. And I just stopped in the aisle and I went, this is something that is really, really critical in understanding my behavior at this moment in time. Why did I actually go, these are too hard to buy, even though I wanted them? And I went to another aisle and I bought these others instead. And in this instance, it wasn't so I could eat any in the car on the way home, because I knew I just wanted to take them home and put them in the cupboard for later. And what it was, there was that impression and that imprint of these others are just too difficult, even though I want them. And so I really say to everybody, whether it's your business or your customer's business, or even in your own, unit at work, where are these small friction points occurring where we just go, we give up and go, oh, it's too hard, even if it's something we want to do? Or where are we putting friction in front of our employees or customers when they, and it's causing this barrier? So I started to look what's in my cupboard, and I really recommend you start going home and you actually start having a look at what else gives you that little niggle, that contraction or that disengagement. And so another one for me was the Oral-B dental floss. And there is a perforation on the back there somewhere, which I can't see. And as you can see, you can't see it either. But anytime I want to open these, I've got to get those scissors out again. And I go, why is it that people are making things that are so difficult? Thankfully, I don't need to open these up too often because the floss lasts a long time. But I started then going through and just observing my own behaviour. And I'd observe when I would get frustrated that, little slight frustration versus not. And then I started sharing it all with my partner. And then my partner starts sharing all these friction points that they feel. And so suddenly this whole world of friction starts to escalate. And that's what you see everywhere. The other thing that's really good in this space of friction is it allows and gives a way of conversing around something where you would obviously usually be negative, but it allows for positive dissent, we call it. So it gives actually a framework for us to talk about something that's negative in an organisation, and it gives us room to do something with it. And here's another, this was an actual classic example that happened last year at Christmas time on Boxing Day sales. We decided to buy a new doona, and what arrived was an air fryer. And we went, how did you get that wrong? So we rang up to actually try and send the air fryer back. And it turned out it was so difficult for, I think this was David Jones at the time, for them to actually take the air fryer back that they actually said, just keep it. And we went, wow, we've just got a $500 item because the friction that occurred in their ordering system and now the friction in the returns was just too hard. I'm not sure about you, but to not take $500 back, I would be going, well, how much profit did they lose on that Boxing Day sale? And so we didn't need the air fryer, but we ended up giving it away, which was fantastic because somebody else got it for free and they got their double dopamine hit. But it was a really interesting example of just identifying friction again that happens at home. So I really say to everybody, be that experiment of n equals 1. And I do this across the board with behavioural science. It's, I'd say I probably learn, even after all these years later, each week, there's probably another heuristic or bias that I go, oh my gosh, there's a new one I've just learned about me and seen it live, in my day. And if you look at it in your day, then you often can start saying, well, how does that apply in my work? Rather than starting with a big project where we all get overwhelmed and do nothing, you start then integrating it in your conversations and you integrate them in your conversations at work. So friction is everywhere and it can actually make you more money than increasing customers. So we spend so much time and energy, and I've come from a marketing strategic background, which was always about filling the funnel, filling the funnel with customers. And then we go, well, what happens when the customers arrive? Are we happy just to let them go? Which means we need to keep filling the funnel a lot more. And so one of the things that has changed for me, which I never realized would actually occur because I was a firm believer in customer journeys, when we used to do our brand plans, we'd work out these tipping points on a customer journey, and we'd invest our strategic thinking and our tactics and promotional spend and go, well, at these major points, these orange dots say on the screen, if these inflection points, if we can change a customer at this point with this promotion and this activity, then we get a big win. And so now I'm actually more interested in what we call the friction journey. And so we go into organizations and we actually map out the friction. And we go, well, let's have a look at all these milliseconds of, problems that are occurring in milliseconds of time. And let's start making what is the conscious ones. They're pretty easy to plot. But let's start trying to actually tap into unconscious behavior and becoming aware of our unconscious behavior as we go through that journey from a customer or an employee in any given situation and see where these friction points are occurring. And so what's been really interesting in this space, though, has been that as we map them, you can often find quick wins and big wins. And I'm a big fan of a quick win. If a customer gets a quick win, then another one, everyone gets a pat on the back and then they go, what else can we do? Whereas if you start with something too difficult, we can all get overwhelmed and nothing happens and we say that didn't work. When in fact it could have worked, it's just that we brought it in too soon. But what we've also found is that sometimes those big wins, what you can do is you can find a big win can actually then release this whole domino effect of friction points that were there. But you could have spent time trying to address all these little friction points. Yet if you just got rid of this one here, that tail just disappears. And so it's pretty cool when you start actually looking at what are the friction points and which are the quick ones and the big ones. And then also what we find critical, and this is certainly an element of behavioural science coming into looking at friction, which ones are the peak negative and positive end experiences. Obviously, the peak good ones are the ones that we like, but those peak negative ones and how something ends are what gets hardwired in a brain. So as we're mapping this friction journey, we're also looking at what is an end experience. And that end experience could be multiple endings that a customer has with your brand along this journey. And how do we actually identify them? Because they really what we say are the most critical ones to address first, those peak ones which will get hardwired in your brain. Excuse me. So one of these, end experiences I think that we're all familiar with and we've all seen the solution to and use ourselves is that whole idea of, filling in forms online, which we all hate, that commitment that we hate around them, and the introduction of the checkout as guest button. And so, already we've got choice, which makes it easier for our brain. Already we feel less, contraction and we feel more expansion. So we're actually more likely to engage. And then we actually go in and we actually can provide our information, which is usually the same amount of information. It's just that it's done in a different way. And more importantly, psychologically, my brain doesn't feel as committed and doesn't feel like there's as much friction in that journey. So we had this opportunity, which was with a real estate agent. And this is one of the small businesses I worked with. And that client, they wanted to meet with me because they wanted to increase the number of customers coming into the real estate agency. And that in that intent, they wanted to actually increase their advertising spend. Now, I went to go to the meeting. And what happened was this was in prime location. And I could hardly even open. They had a sliding door, which was so heavy, this sliding door, I could hardly get in there. And I think the only reason I bothered was I was getting paid to attend a meeting. But what it did for me was it sort of jolted this idea of, well, how many other customers are not coming in because they just simply can't open the door? And so I can honestly say with my old, marketing hat and strategist hat, I never would have even considered this as an option for a client to go, well, let's actually map the friction. And so the receptionist was the person who sees the most of what goes on. And we decided we would actually, before the client spent any money on advertising, we would get the receptionist to actually track for 3 weeks who's coming in the doors before we open them. And so she started tracking it. And she's obviously the portal and information of the most knowledge of the dynamic of what's going on in this business. And so we could see who's coming to sell a property, to rent a property, who's coming in to help their business, their staff, and also tradespeople and anyone else who was coming in. And then they opened the doors. So for 3 weeks, we tracked who was coming in, we opened the doors. And by simply opening the door and removing that friction, there was a 30% increase in traffic. And I went, oh my God, did we really get a 30% increase in traffic just from that? And so again, it's just a different way of thinking and feeling. When you start feeling friction in environments, you do start saying, well, how do we just remove it? Is there a way we could do that before we spent big money over clients? And so let's have a look at the other end of town. So that was just one small one that I showed you. And at the other end of town, companies like Facebook and Amazon and Zoom have all actually endorsed and are creating these friction-free environments. And so Facebook, and you can download this. This is some free, if you want to have a look at their information and some ideas around creating a zero friction future, as they call it, you can actually start to see what they're trying to create. And they're creating a way that it is from the beginning to the end, a get-go of every engagement that you have with Facebook and, from your advertising through to the app and a customer leaving the app, that they actually have a friction-free experience. And so their motto, and this came out, I think it was in 2019, is to create this zero friction future. And here's just one example of Ralph Lauren, which they took some of the advice, from Facebook, and they had a 9.6% higher lift in online purchases and an 80% decrease in cost per incremental purchase. And if you want to have a look at, I think there's another 2 or 3 examples in there of, what are we losing and how can we gain some of that back? And I guess I'm a big fan of nobody's in business to lose money, yet we're spending a lot of money doing the same and on the mouse wheel without really understanding how else can we optimize it and make things more effective. And so one of the businesses I'm involved in, my global strategic partner for, and this happened from last year, is Behavioural. And some of you may know Behavioural, and they have 2 products on the market at the moment. One's called Nudge and one is Diagnostic. And the intent is to create this customer experience that is really easy, and they nudge them with behavioural science. But it's very dynamic, so it uses AI to actually understand behaviour and pop up the right nudges. And this is a pay-on performance model, so if it doesn't increase revenue, you don't pay. And across the board, they're getting up to a 20% increase in revenue on e-commerce sites, which is pretty profound. And this started out actually with the intent to try and reduce the friction around particularly in Europe, the number of products that get sent back in fashion because people order multiple sizes, which is great for the person, but very costly for the business. And so the two founders who, originally are in Switzerland, they decided to build this model. One's an ex-Google programmer and the other is a behavioural scientist, and they have been very successful with it. A second platform that they created is called Diagnostic, and to me this is more about the friction. And what they've been able to do is on a website to look at where their drop-off is occurring, but more importantly, put a revenue association next to it. And they can then provide you the pathway of where you can solve that issue. And it also gives you the ability to prioritise how you actually use your resources, because the ones that are costing you the most money are obviously the ones you want to fix first. And Behavioural is very well endorsed and backed by universities. It's a spin-off of St. Gallen University in Switzerland, and they still work with universities around the world to actually gather more data on nudges. And as you can see, a lot of the clients are obviously major clients around the world. And so they've been very successful in Europe, and now they're expanding to America. And I came across Thilo and Behavioural, and I've added them into my offer here in Australia. So I do say to anyone who is on this today that if you have clients or you are a client with an e-commerce online store with more than 300,000 visitors to your store a month, there's certainly some opportunity to, evaluate that. One, add nudges and remove friction for a customer, and second, look at where it's falling over. So enough about my little sales pitch on Behavioural. Let me share with you some other examples of what we're seeing in market. And so here's one from Amazon. And so Amazon, not the front end of it, but the packaging end of it and the suppliers to it, they decided that they needed to become or reduce the friction, have less friction in terms of the packaging that people actually were receiving, because there were so many complaints that came, and it also cost them a lot of money to actually ship them around. So Amazon introduced their frustration-free packaging program, and these guidelines have 3 tiers, and you must adhere to one of those 3 tiers to actually be a supplier on the Amazon platform. And so they show, the after and the before. It's easy to open, recycled, less protective packaging, rather than being difficult to open, not recyclable, and standard packaging. So it's about, using that East model, firstly, of making things easy. And they looked at, well, this is just one product on its own, and this was a men's shaver, I think it is. And this razor, you can see on the left what it used to have in terms of packaging versus on the right-hand side, their frustration-free packaging. And we go, well, what a relief it is that we don't receive all of that anymore. So critically, though, was that they put measurement around it. And all of us know that in behavioural science, we love to measure the befores and afters, so we get proof points of success. So not only did they reduce for this one product the packaging components from 13 to 9, they also reduced the volume in their space, the inches that were required, by 80%, which then, of course, it reduced the amount of space required when they're shipping all of their products around the world. And that's an 82% reduction in that space required for shipping. So there's massive measurement and financial implications, obviously, upside for them in this one product alone, let alone all of the products that they're shipping around the world. What was also interesting is that changed their complaints by 70% by changing their packaging. And so what they did was, obviously, they were setting up a new default mandate, which we also know is the fastest way to change behaviour, is setting up a different default in terms of those tiers of packaging. And that actually then changed behaviour and also was financially better for them. So I say to everybody, as always, look at what defaults you can change. If there's an area that's causing friction, can you change a default that just eliminates it straight away by setting this new norm? There's obviously startups and unicorns that have actually created their own reason for being by removing friction, and Uber was obviously one of those. And what I say with a lot of startups, I do work with quite a few startups, is that they've created to reduce friction, and they're very proud of having reduced this friction, yet then they don't actually look at reducing friction within their organization or on their customer journey with those friction journeys. So I always say, well, let's actually add that into your mission as well, which is very much what Zoom did. And before I get on to this, I'll just mention that Zoom actually had that in their mission statement, was that, they wanted to be a friction-free or frictionless organization. And that gave permission when COVID happened. We all used to use a different platform than Zoom or Teams. And overnight, virtually, they became this instant sensation because everyone in their organisation were looking at how to improve it and reduce friction. So to give you another example of a client success that we had, and this is in a SaaS space, it was an app, communication apps for schools. And the problem with this app was that the schools were dropping off and they had quite a high rate of dropout. And for SaaS products, if anyone's in that space, you know, we actually know that that should really be sitting at around the 90 to 95% retention rates. And so what we did here was we engaged the customer success team. And firstly, we looked at the data, and I looked at the data and I could see that the information that had been put in to actually measure churn and start to identify, you know, with red, green and orange flags who was likely to leave was actually not substantial enough to provide that information. And this business had spent 6 months building that platform. And so it turns out that 6 months of, you know, building the content, the data, and these parameters was actually, one, a waste of time and a waste of the money that they spent on this software. And this was only a skills issue. It was because the customer success team didn't really understand what the parameters were that they should have put in to identify churn. And so what I do find is that we go in and we're invited in to do a friction audit. And the way we start with a team is we actually upskill the team. So we present to them on friction. We usually present to them on the East model. During the conversations, friction starts getting identified. And then we encourage that team to go away and for 2 weeks to actually start writing out all the friction that they see in the business. We separately and in parallel do our own friction audit with them. So that's what occurred in this space. And we regrouped 2 weeks later, and it turned out everyone in the customer success team had the same first issue of friction. And this was one of those areas where if we finished and fixed the first one, that whole tail disappeared. And it was a design flaw. It was, you know, a design flaw in the onboarding for the schools. And so they went back, they thought they had actually improved it, and they turned out they'd made it more difficult. And so they took them 3 months to change the design, and credit to the CEO. She said, look, that's what we're going to go back to. We're going to make this better. And so we waited for, while we were waiting for that, you know, change in design, we actually mapped out with the customer success team what the onboarding would be to remove friction over a 3-month period with all of their customers. And so it turns out they set goals month on month, and after a year, we had actually reduced their churn rate by 7.6%, which, as you know, is quite considerable for any business. And so, you know, they became churn heroes, and even the platform supplier that they measured themselves on had never seen such a turnaround so quickly. So there's a lot of benefit when you actually start engaging and empowering people. And the sort of unintended consequence that we saw here was that the head of customer success suddenly became a big fan of the data. And so it wasn't long before he was promoted to be head of operations, because he was seeing how what he was a little bit threatened for at the beginning of this project, our job was to handhold and empower him, and he could see the benefit of that. And obviously he and his team had these results, you know, to prove their success, which was a huge win. And so getting teams involved gives a lot of I guess, direction and a dynamic space for them to work in. And so the way we tend to work then with organisations is we firstly will upskill them in friction and the East model. We'll run a data audit. We'll look at some quick wins and big wins. Then we actually create a plan of how we actually remove the friction points and who's associated with them, and then get some proof of impact and measures, and then introduce checklists for change. So this is our ideal scenario of how we would actually map it out. In all of that, you create feedback loops also for your teams. And what we find is that that starts changing the conversations. You know, when I start hearing people saying that's a friction point, that could be a friction point, I know we're actually changing culture, and that's a really good space to be. So as I mentioned, we also update them with the East model, which I think a lot of you are familiar with from the Behavioural Insights team. And we've adapted that model and come up with our own checklist of some starting points for them to work with. And then what we've also done is we usually give them some handouts depending on which type of business it is. Some of them are online businesses, others are on land businesses. We give them some information about the brain and also about their blind spots in decision making, and a way for them to capture all the friction points so we can actually come back and regroup. Depending on the business, as I mentioned, some of the friction we're looking at is from a customer perspective. So we want them to actually be a customer from their perspective. And we also go through that process as a customer and start identifying what would be considered conscious and unconscious friction points. Or if it's for internal, we give them thought starters as well on what is the friction point they could be looking at, whether it's with people, process, product, and the business itself, and start to see where they actually lie. And so they're really the areas we're looking at, are people, product, and process, but also looking at what's the physical friction. Is there any time-based friction? Do things take too long? If you're online, does it take too long for something to load up or to go through a checkout? And also emotional, and psychological friction points that could exist. And where we end up is actually identifying a total number of friction points for the business. Or it might be a department. You might want to pilot it in one area and go, well, let's just start and play around with it, and have a look at what we find. And then look at those that we call the peak end rule, critical and urgent ones, where we've got a lot of negative peaks and negative endings. And then we also do it by department. So we can actually assign, who needs to do what. And usually it is, the teams who have helped actually build this list of friction points. Along the way, again, depending on the nature of the business, we will either video or photograph exactly what we're going through. I unfortunately can't share that with you due to confidentiality, because I would love to show exactly how we then mark that up and show a client where the friction points are and where they may have missed, what is happening for a customer's journey. And we'll identify all the actual touch points in a journey and identify which ones are going well, which ones aren't, and which are maybe neutral, when in fact every touch point in this journey could actually be a positive one, and be in complete fluency and flow. As I mentioned, with the ones that are the negative peaks and ends, we'll also give them nudge recommendations on what they could actually do immediately to identify and remove them. And some of them may take resources and others not. So again, we're looking at which are the quick wins and which are the big wins. And then we will actually develop that into an action plan for those businesses. So there's quite a lot that actually gets done. However, it's also very dynamic, because we're looking at friction and it's something that people start to associate with, and we're changing culture. And people are starting to speak differently. They get empowered as they start seeing that their friction is starting to be, eliminated. And what's key here is that we often find that an employee could have been complaining about something for years and nothing's changed. And now we've given it a boundary and a framework to actually be addressed. And that now is taken as a friction point. And you create this leaderboard and you start showing improvement, and people actually start seeing change in an organization. And so for teams, this becomes really, really a powerful way, because, often they don't actually speak up for fear or disengagement or feeling that they'll be disempowered, even if they're sitting in a room going, I already know this isn't going to work, Sonia, or their boss or someone. We need to give them this framework to speak up. And for those of you who work in behavioural science, I'm not sure about you, but I found that friction and pre-mortems are the two positive ways to actually encourage employee dissent in a positive and constructive way within an organisation. And so, just taking that to another level in terms of, where friction points can actually work in your favour or against you. We actually know, like in some industries, for instance, in motorcar racing and Formula One, that time is of the essence. And, everybody thinks that things can take a long time. And here we have, I think it's 18 people that can actually change the tyres, in 1.82 seconds. So when you have harmony, a lot of things can actually work in your favour. And they get to this because they practice and remove friction all through that process. And when it doesn't go right, it can go very, very wrong, and we've all seen this, that things blow up. And they blow up in our teams, they blow up with our people, and they happen usually because we haven't held it in the right way, or somebody's gone off and done something as they shouldn't have, And so the whole thing is, how do we hold the team through it? So I guess my challenge to everyone, if you're not doing it already, is firstly start seeing friction in your everyday. Like me with my mission chips, and which I always buy. And usually I'm presenting live, so I give them to someone in the audience. And sorry, today I'll be giving them to myself. So there's some loss aversion that I've just created with all of you, and you just feel a little bit of friction yourself. And let's finish on Richard Thaler's words, which are, if you want to encourage someone to do something, make it easier. And as I mentioned earlier, I've added to that, make it easier and easiest. And as we know, wherever possible, do it for me. And I'll finish on, if I can't be bothered to do it for you as best I can, why would we expect a customer to do it, when we can't do it for them? So that's me. I love speaking about friction and finding it. And thank you very much for listening, and happy to answer any questions. And I will stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That was great. I love this idea of being an observer of yourself and picking up friction. I'm already thinking of the many different ways that there's friction in my life. So we have a few minutes now for some questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. I think we've got a couple coming through already. Oh, yes. So someone saying, similar to your air fryer experience, Sonia, they had that with a mobile phone. A $1,200 phone was too hard for Telstra to take back. So it seems like that's a common experience. A question from Francois: would you agree that the power of removing friction is only as strong as the accuracy of the frictions identified? And if so, what methodology would you typically use for a friction audit?
Well, sometimes, thanks, Francois. Sometimes adding friction is actually beneficial. So it's not always about removing friction. It just depends on the behavioural that you want to change. And I think the key becomes in understanding, for me, the biggest ones are identifying the peaks and the ends. They're usually the ones that have the most impact on that journey. And there might be, you might have, like we had 100 friction points in a journey, but 3 of them are super critical, or 22 of them are super critical. And yes, it becomes about, when are those drop off points. So for instance, with one client, they use a well-known ticketing system, and it was 21 steps to buy a ticket to their event. Now, in this day and age, that's unheard of, and the drop-offs are really, really significant. And this client ended up building their own ticketing system, which was a recommendation for us. Now, that recommendation was a multi-million-dollar recommendation for them, but it also had a multi-million-dollar bottom line impact. So, some of the solutions are not quick fixes, whereas others are, oh, we can just move this out of the way and it's gone. So the methodology is, it depends which problem it is. If it's an online problem, then obviously we use 2 methods. One is we look at, if it's an online store, we'll look at Behavioural for one end of it, but we'll also do a behavioural design audit at the front end and a friction audit of the actual website. And I have a team of consultants that work with me, so they will usually do that for me. If it's on land, then what we do is we usually get multiple people to actually do a friction audit who are in behavioural science, who understand how to actually make the unconscious conscious, because not everybody has done that, and I think that's the hardest. Most of us can find those easy friction points that we can all see, but it's the other ones that really trip us up, that we go, well, what just happened? A bit like me with, why did I just actually not even pick it up and go around the corner? And it takes practice to understand your unconscious. And so I think for me, that's an asset that I now know I have. I know I've got people in my team who have that asset, and I know others don't. So the story for us is not just us doing it. It is, how do we empower teams to do it as well? And all through behavioural science, I'm a big fan of, don't keep the mystery to myself. It's like, teach a man to fish. So hopefully that's answered that question.
Francois, was that answering your question? I see you're...
I'm not sure you can hear me, can you?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Sorry. Yes, thank you very much, Sonia. I guess I was more alluding to, do you actually tend to talk to customers rather than talk to users who are not necessarily customers? Because everyone not everybody will feel the frictions the
Yeah.
same way. You know, for example, your chip example, I was thinking that just wouldn't stop me. I wouldn't necessarily go and buy, if they're the ones I want, I'll just use scissors to get to them. But, you know, everybody's different, right?
Yeah, sure.
So,
So,
because I
the
feel
whole
that
thing, you're gone.
often companies make the mistake of forgetting to actually talk to the customer.
Yeah, or to be it.
Questions.
I agree with you. I think
Mm.
even, you know, I've been in some marketing teams and I'll give you one client. I said, well, when's the last time you bought a ticket to your event? And not one person in the team had. And I went, well, okay, let's everybody tonight, your task is to go and buy a ticket. And so they did. And then suddenly everything becomes real, you know, and as we know, Francois, you know, experience changes our belief and behavior faster than awareness and education. So the biggest thing for us is to try and insert ourselves into being the customer or the employee, depending on what that dynamic is. And the second is to actually get them to be it as well, so that they actually become it. And then you go, well, how can you do that regularly? It's not a one and done thing, but absolutely. And it doesn't matter where you are in an organization, you know, what is that user experience? So if we're in other dynamics, we might shadow people, you know, you shadow them in their role so that you actually go, my God, what are you doing that for? Or you see where they're doing something 5 times, or you see where they're tripping over. I just have, you know, we've got the luxury of phones. We can video record and take photos on the spot of those incidents, because then they're real. And I think we all know just giving information back to an organization doesn't mean a lot until you show it in action.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you.
A couple of questions from here in the room. So Adeline is wondering, where have you seen companies successfully use friction in a positive way, e.g. to improve decision-making or understanding of potential consequences of the actions they're about to take?
Sure. I think enforcing checklists is one of them. You know, I think there's some simple tools where you can go, well, I actually need to stop you before you actually do something. And I did work with one organization, you know, they had checklists everywhere. And that's where, you know, we like introducing them as well. But you go, people might normally just go through the motions of something. And we go, actually, now we want you to go through these steps because we do see that there's a friction that's created or there's inconsistency. And I think a checklist is one of the easiest ways to do it. The other trick, I guess, I think that I use a lot in behavioral science is creating everything as a draft. And so, you know, when people get things and they think it's finished and it's been brought in certainly by an external consultant, you know, it's like, well, who are you and what do you know? And so it creates extra steps for me. But what I also know is that when you introduce something, you say it's a draft for you now to try and use in your space. And now we can actually mold it and adapt it live. It takes more time and it's actually really, really effective. And I don't mind if it's a draft forever.
Okay. And another question here we have from Viv. Many businesses focus on enhancing the customer experience by introducing new features and benefits rather than addressing friction points within the experience. Doing more is not always better. How can we influence or empower a change in this mindset?
That's very true. And I think for me, it is about eliminating the steps. You know, I absolutely agree with you, Viv. I mean, I think the more you can eliminate, the better. And I think in behavioural science, you know, particularly if it's online, as you're speaking about, we can run split tests. And so my suggestion would be, well, run somewhere like we're about to do it with something with a client, with something as simple as they've got too many menu headers. And we know if you reduce the menu headers that it will increase conversion. You know, it's like choice overload. And so you go, well, let's actually remove that, but we'll do it as a split test. And people say, well, how do you get people to do that? Thankfully, in that space, they're used to it. But I have been a bit of a proponent of, well, without the data, we won't do anything. And so I start, you know, will I lose business over it? I haven't yet. And I think it's about getting over ourselves and our own loss aversion and fear. So what does it do? It slows down projects, but we get proof points. I'm doing something with a client at the moment where we're doing some pricing nudges. 3 of them should have worked in my mind, and they haven't. And they have with any other client that I've worked with, but with this client, they're not. And we're running them as nudges, and we're getting proof points, and we're building up their IP assets for that business specifically. And, we've got a nudge plan. And now we're actually looking at how do we remove friction across the internals of the organization and bring in checklists and all that. So there's some wins you can have. And yes, I think there's a really good book. I'll spruik my friend Roger Dooley, the master of friction, who has written the book Friction. Roger is part of the Diversify Global Group. And if you're looking for some reading on it, he writes for Forbes magazine in the US. He's based in Texas. And it's a great book to read. The cost of friction is enough. And I think, to me, I always try and put a financial value on anything, because money you can attach to anything. And if you say, well, you're losing an extra 30,000 or 50,000 or $1 million, then people actually look, which is why I love what Behavioural is doing with diagnostic. There's a price tag attached to it. You just lost $34,000 today because your image is loaded too slow. It's powerful,
Yeah, really powerful. Well, I think that's all of the questions we have for today. Thank you so much, Sonia, for taking the time to be with us. It was a really great session. Thank you, everyone who's joined online. As always, the next session will be held on the last Thursday of August, so keep an eye out. We'll be posting about the speaker for August. Thank you, everyone, and take care. Thanks, Sonia.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I just saw a pop-up, Roger Dooley, and the book is Friction. Somebody just asked. So look that up today and buy one, and it will be a treat. I'll let him know I've given him a spruik. Thanks very much, Grace and Adeline and Aaron. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here with you all, and enjoy seeing you friction at home tonight.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Sonia.